Sometimes you may take a photo of a beautiful subject, but you end up with a boring gray sky. Unfortunately, you cannot control the weather, but there's a lot you can do in Photoshop to make a boring gray sky into an amazing blue sky. In this video, I'm going to show you several techniques to enhance your skies and make them blue in Photoshop. Hi, I'm Jesus Ramirez from the Photoshop Training Channel. This Photoshop tutorial is going to be packed with information as usual, so make sure that you stick around into the very end so that you don't miss any Photoshop tips and tricks. Also, if this is your first time at the Photoshop Training Channel, then don't forget to click on that subscribe and notification buttons. Let's just get right to it. This is the image that I'm going to work with. I was in Milan, Italy recently. I was there for a little over a day, but I got to take this photo of the Duomo. Unfortunately, it was an overcast day, and this photo would have been much better if the sky was blue, so that it would contrast better with the yellows and oranges of the Duomo. In this video, I'm going to show you a few techniques that you can use to make the sky blue in your overcast photos. The first step is to convert your image into a smart object. We want to work non-destructively, so I'm just going to right click and select convert to smart object. A smart object is simply a container that holds one or more layers, and it allows you to apply adjustments, distortions, filters, and transformations non-destructively, which means you can always come back and edit them. You can tell that the layer is a smart object by looking at this little tiny icon here on the bottom right of the layer thumbnail. Now that we have a smart object, there's one thing that you can try in your photos. I know that it's not going to work for this image, but maybe it works in your photo. So I want to show you anyway. I'm going to go into Filter, Camera Raw Filter. From the Camera Raw Filter, we can adjust the tonality and color of the image. We also have this wonderful tab called the HSL Adjustment tab. This tab allows us to control the hue, saturation, and luminance of individual colors with these sliders. Notice that one of the sliders is titled Blues. That means that we can control the hue, saturation, and luminance of the blues. I'm already in the luminance slider, so I can drag the blue slider to the left to try to get some blue back into that sky. In this image, this is really not going to work. There's a lot of JPEG compression artifacts in that photo, which, by the way, I have a tutorial that shows you how to remove JPEG artifacts from a photo. I'm not going to do that in this tutorial, but if you're wondering how to do that, I'll place a link down below in the description for that video. But anyway, this technique is not going to work in this photo, but it may work in your image. We might be able to just move it a little bit and try to get more blue in there, but this is really not going to work. You could also try adding a little bit of saturation into the blues, and maybe that gives you a better result. But again, in this case, I'm not going to use the Camera Raw filter in this step. So I'm just going to press cancel. What I'm going to do instead is create a digital sky. But first, I need to make a selection out of the sky. And one of the easiest ways of doing that with an image like this that has so much detail is by using the channels panel. From here, you will see the red, green, and blue channels that make up the RGB image. These channels are projecting light. When you mix the light of these three channels, you'll generate all the images that you see in Photoshop. And the channels simply tell you that where there's a lot of white, that's a lot of red light. And where there's black, there is no red light. All three lights together make white. In the absence of all three lights, make black. But anyway, what you need to do is click on each individual channel and see which of the channels has more contrast between the foreground and background. In most cases, for projects like these, it will be the blue channel because there's blue in the sky, and there probably won't be much blue in the foreground, depending on the photo that you have, of course. In this case, the blue channel works best, so we're going to create a channel-based selection out of the blue channel. The next step is to duplicate the channel. You can duplicate the channel by clicking the channel and dragging it over into the new channel icon, and you'll get a copy. You don't have to rename the copy if you don't want to. I'm going to leave mine as default. Next, you need to make the sky white and everything else black. So one of the things that you can do is you can start by using the dodge and burn tools. The dodge tool allows you to make pixels brighter. Which pixels are you going to make brighter? In the options bar, you can see this drop down titled range, and you can target the shadows, midtones, and highlights. In this case, I want to work with the highlights, and we'll use an exposure. This is the intensity of 50%. So notice that when I paint in these bright areas, the image gets much, much brighter. But if I paint on these darker areas, the effect is much more subtle. So this tool allows you to target specific tonal ranges. I'm going to press Ctrl Z on Windows, Command Z on the Mac to undo that change. And I'm just going to paint very loosely on the sky. And it's okay if I touch the Duomo. I'm not really going to make it white, but I'm going to try to stay away from it as much as I can since I don't want to lose a lot of those smaller details. I just want to make sure that these areas are completely white. Like so. Next, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to select the burn tool. I'm going to select shadows. Exposure at 50% is fine. I can increase or decrease the size of my brush by tapping on the left or right bracket keys on the keyboard. I'm going to make my brush larger and I'm just going to paint here like so. Just trying to make some of those edge pixels darker. I don't need to worry too much about the pixels in the center because what I can do is just select the lasso tool and just quickly freehand a very loose selection around these pixels. Like so. And if you make a mistake, you can always come back and make adjustments. You can hold Shift and click and drag to add to a selection, or you can hold Alt on Windows, Option on the Mac, and click and drag to subtract. So just make the appropriate selection for your image. And I guess I might as well select these areas. But anyway, now that I have this selection active, what I can do is fill with black. Black is currently my background color, so I can press Control Backspace on Windows. That's Command Delete on the Mac to fill with the background color. Then I can press Control D, Command D on the Mac to deselect. And we're going to use a really powerful feature in Photoshop that allows us to take this channel and apply it to itself using a blending mode to either enhance the shadows or highlights. Let me show you how that works. I'm going to go into Image, Apply Image. Then I can select what channel I'm using. I'm going to use the blue copy, and I can select the blending mode. Currently, the selected blending mode is screen, and notice what happens here. Let me move this to the side. I'm going to uncheck preview, and you can see that Photoshop is applying this channel with the screen blending mode onto itself, which makes the image brighter. So see that? And by the way, here's a pro tip. You can always press the P key on the keyboard on any window that has a preview checkbox to enable or disable that checkbox. But anyway, I'm going to leave it set to screen. You could always adjust the opacity if you want to. In this case, I don't need to. I'm going to leave it at 100 and I'll press OK. Next, I'm going to do the same thing, but this time I'm going to make the channel darker. So I'm going to go into Image, Apply Image, and instead of selecting the screen blending mode, I'm going to select the multiply blending mode because that makes things darker. By the way, if you're not familiar with blending modes or why these blending modes are working the way that they are, I have a tutorial that talks about all the blending modes. It's an in-depth tutorial. I also have a written article about it. I'll place a link down below in the description if you want to learn more about blending modes. But anyway, so you can select multiply, or you could also select color burn. And you can actually go down the list and see if any of these darkening blending modes make a better adjustment for what you're trying to do. And in this case, it looks like the linear burn does a really good job. See how it just makes everything so much darker? So I'm going to try that. Linear burn. I'll press OK. And I can even do it again. Image, Apply Image. And that does a really good job. And you can keep applying that over and over again until you get all the smaller details. Or you can go into the brush tool and just make a smaller brush and make it a little bit harder so the edges are not too soft. And make sure that you set black as your foreground color, and you can paint away these smaller details. Again, you can use the bracket keys on the keyboard to increase or decrease the size of your brush as you paint. I'm not going to spend too much time fine-tuning the image, but in your project, spend a little more time, obviously. So we'll just say that this is good for now. And I can now make a selection out of the bright pixels in this channel. I can simply hold Control, Command on the Mac, and click on the channel thumbnail, and that will load the bright pixels as a selection. I can click on RGB and go back into the Layers panel, and from here, I can create a gradient fill layer. And that's going to create that gradient. but the fill will not be applied to the Duomo because of the layer mask, obviously. And what I'm going to do now is simply select the color that I'm going to use for the fill by clicking on the gradient editor here. This window will come up. And what you can do is click on black and white if you're in an older version of Photoshop. If you're in the Creative Cloud, there's a different method that I'll show you in a moment. If you're in an older version of Photoshop, you can click on this swatch and then just make this one like an off blue color. And then this one on the right, double click on it and make it a blue that is similar to the color of the sky that you want to have. If you're in a new version of Photoshop, you'll have access to this blues folder where you can click on these pre-made gradients. For example, there's another one in here that'll look good for a different time of day. I think is this one here. Yeah, this one here will work for maybe like an early morning or afternoon or something like that, and you can adjust it accordingly, of course. The point is that you have all these different gradients in these groups, not just blues, but all different kinds. So you can use those as well. There's also these cloud gradients that you can use that might help you generate skies as well. But for what I'm going for in this case, I think that the blues will work great. And the one that I'm going to use is the very first one, this one here. And what I want to do is drag the blue onto the right side and the lighter color onto the left side. And I can double click on it and edit it if I need to. I just wanted to show you that it's just an off-white color. I'll press OK. And this is our image. I can now press OK once more, and I can click and drag to adjust my fill. Now, something very important when you're doing this is that you don't want to make your sky too dark. You got to look at the image itself and see the other elements. For example, you can see a lot of atmospheric perspective here on the back part of the Duomo. So if I were to make my sky darker, then it wouldn't look very realistic because this part of the Duomo is very bright and it has a lot of atmospheric perspective. So be careful with that. I want to show you in a moment something that you can do to alleviate that problem. But in most cases, you just want to adjust these accordingly so that you don't necessarily have to change the elements of the image unless you really have to. So once again, you can click and drag on the actual gradient fill to determine how much blue you have or how much white. And you can increase the scale as well. So maybe in this case, I'll increase the scale and do something like this. Maybe even drag it up a little bit more since we need this area to be brighter. I'll press OK. And this is my before and this is after. Now we are going to run into some problems in images like this one that have a lot of small intricate details. Let me zoom in into this area here on the left hand side. I'm going to press the Z key on the keyboard to select the zoom tool, and then I'm going to zoom in. And notice that this area is just completely destroyed by that mask. So you can see what the original image looks like, and you can see the results with this mask. One way to fix this problem is by clicking on the blending mode dropdown and simply selecting the multiply blending mode. So that's multiply, and this is normal. So huge difference. You bring the detail back from the original image. So make sure that you use the multiply blending mode. I think that it does a really good job and it gives you great results. Now that you brought back all that detail into the image, let me show you other things that you can do to further enhance that photo. I'm going to double click on the hand tool to fit the image to screen, and you can see the before and the after. I think that the sky might be a little too dark because notice that the tower back here just looks way brighter than the sky. So instead of making this darker or reducing the opacity, which is actually something that will work very well like you saw there, I'm going to try to make the back darker because in some cases you may want to have just a little bit of a darker sky. So how do I make this particular tower darker? Let me show you a really cool technique. First of all, you can create a curves adjustment layer. Then delete the layer mask. So right click and select delete layer mask. And you already probably know that you can hold Alt on Windows option on the Mac and drag the layer mask to duplicate it onto another layer. But doing so makes it so that we're affecting the sky. And we want to do the opposite. We want to affect the building. So obviously you can click on the layer mask and click on invert. And now when you make an adjustment, it only affects the building, right? But there's actually a better way of doing that. And let me first click on this reset icon to reset that. And let me right click on that layer mask and select delete layer mask. And the faster way of doing that is by clicking on the original layer mask. And remember what we want to do. We want to duplicate the layer mask and invert it at the same time. To do that, you can hold Alt and Shift, that's Option Shift on the Mac, and click and drag that layer mask onto another layer, and it duplicates it and inverts it at the same time. That's a really powerful keyboard shortcut that I recommend that you use. Let me know down in the comments below if you're familiar with that keyboard shortcut. But anyway, we have this curves adjustment layer that is targeting the Duomo. So see, when I click and drag, I'm only affecting the building. So what I'm going to do is click on this direct selection tool so that I can hover over the image. You'll notice that in the curve, that point will appear. So that's where these pixels appear on the image. So I'm going to click and drag down to make those darker. But notice that I make the entire image dark as well. I really don't want to make the building itself darker. So I'm going to click on the building and drag up. So I'm only making that back part darker. Obviously, I'm affecting the entire image, but here's the trick for you. I'm going to create a group, and I'll just call this group Atmosphere, because I'm going to try to fix the atmosphere with that group. And I'm going to click that curves adjustment layer into that group. Then I'm going to collapse it, and I'm going to hold Alt on Windows, Option on the Mac, and click on the layer mask icon to create a black layer mask, which will hide everything in that group. From the toolbar, I can select the brush tool and make sure that white is my foreground color. So I can click on this icon here to swap the foreground and background color. And I can start painting now with white in the areas where I want to reveal that effect. Let me zoom in so that you get a closer look at that. See how I'm only painting on that tower now? I'm not affecting the sky. I'm not affecting the other parts of the building. That's because we have two layer masks working essentially on one part. We have a layer mask that targets just the building, and then we have a layer mask that hides everything, and now I'm only selectively painting the areas where I want this effect to show. So obviously in your images, spend more time fine-tuning these little details. I'm going to go here fairly quickly so that you can see how this effect works, but I think that you'll get the idea. See how I'm just targeting that back building, and maybe I could do these towers as well. The point is that the building, the Duomo, is a little too bright in those areas, so a darker sky wouldn't look so realistic. So that's before and after. So see that by making that subtle adjustment, the sky no longer looks so off, and I can actually probably go even darker on that sky. So you will have to spend some time in your own images to get the results that you're looking for, but just use these techniques. Again, there's no right number, there's no right value to input on these boxes. It's all up to your eyes. So go ahead and give it a try with your images. Now, before we finish, I want to show you one last thing. I'm going to select the layer on top by clicking on it. Then I'm going to hold Shift, and I'm going to click on this layer here at the bottom. And I'm going to right click and convert it into a smart object. So now I have the before and the after. And what I'm going to do is treat this new layer as a single image and go into Filter, Camera Raw Filter, and from here I can control tonal and color adjustments. So I can start out by adjusting the shadows, maybe making the shadows brighter to bring in just a little more detail in those shadows, and making the highlights darker to add detail to the highlights. And I can increase the texture to make that building pop a little more, and also increase clarity, which is contrast on edge pixels. And I can increase the vibrance, which adds saturation to an image in a smart way. It protects already saturated pixels and skin tone, so I can just add a little bit of vibrance. Then I can go into the Detail tab, and I can increase the sharpening. When you increase the sharpening, you really can't tell what the effect is applied to. So I recommend going into the masking slider and holding the Alt key on Windows, that's the Option key on the Mac, and clicking on that. And if you're holding down that keyboard shortcut, the image will turn white. This is a layer mask basically. White reveals, black conceals. So as I drag to the right, Photoshop will start finding edges, and it will hide things that are not edges the further to the right that I go. So at this point, notice how the sharpening effect is no longer affecting the sky, and that's great. I don't want the sky to be sharpened. And I can continue going further to the right to just isolate those edges. So maybe something like that, maybe 90 or so. So I'll just leave it there. So that's before and after. I know it's a very subtle effect, especially with the compression of the video on YouTube, but hopefully you can see at least a subtle change. And the sharpening is only applied to the edges of the building and not the sky or anything else. I'm going to right click and select Fit in View. And I can now go into the HSL adjustments that we looked at in the beginning of the tutorial. And I can adjust the blues now. See that? See how I can really start adjusting the blues now? And I can now adjust the oranges to maybe make the building a little bit more orange so that it contrasts better with that blue. I can adjust the luminance of that building and of course the sky as well. So feel free to adjust these sliders any way that you want to make your image even more amazing. And you probably already know this by now if you've been watching my tutorials. I always like to add grain to my images to make them look a little more realistic, since if I apply any blur or any compositing or anything like that, I lose that film grain and things don't look very real. They look very computer generated, very smooth. So I always like to add just a little bit of grain to make sure that things don't look so smooth. I'm going to collapse this smart object. Then I'll click on this eye icon and you can see the before and after. I think it looks much better. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Also, let me know what you learned. The comments is the only way that I get to interact with you. So make sure that you leave your thoughts down below. Also, if this is your first time at the Photoshop Training channel, don't forget to click on that subscribe and notification buttons. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you again in the next video.